Amen. You guys can have a seat. And kids, you can head on back to the back. I think you'll have a good time back there today. Well, how is your Christmas season feeling? Mine so far is rainy and kind of messy and a lot of sickness going around. In fact, Matthew, you probably remember him, the guy with the guitar that's up here sometimes, he got sick I want to say Friday, and so Therese jumped in there and did a quick preparation to do a couple of Christmas songs. So Matt is feeling a little sick, so we're hoping he's going to start feeling better soon. But glad to see you guys. Now I want to talk today again about Christmas according to the prophets. And I want to talk about something that might be surprising, something that we really probably don't think of as one of God's Christmas gifts to the world. And it's not a gift that we fully have yet. It's a gift that's sort of still in the waiting. I don't know if you've ever waited for a Christmas present. I know that for me, pretty often, when my wife's either birthday or an anniversary or sometimes even Christmas comes around, I have waited too long to get a present in time, and so I will have a receipt for a present that's been ordered, and I'll say, there's a present on its way, and I got to have that by the day, or I've missed the opportunity. So in a sense, there's a present still coming. It's a present still that we're waiting on. And so when Jesus showed up, he was God's gift to the world, but there's still more to come. And the more to come is something that I think you might find surprising. The more to come is a government. It's a worldwide government that we're going to explore a little bit today. Now that you may think, well, that's kind of a strange thing for the Bible to be talking about, but I think you'll kind of see why it's so interesting. Now I want to give you a little background on some of the ideas that were going on outside of the world of faith around this time that some of these prophets were teaching. So there were some very influential philosophers in Greece, and about the middle of the 3rd, 4th century, there began to be this concept that what the world needs is a different kind of king. Because what they had noticed, guys like Socrates and then one of his students, Plato, began to write about was this idea that most of the kings in the world are pretty awful. Right? I mean, the kings often are the guy with the broadest shoulders who can swing the sword the most in battle, and that guy usually gets put in charge. And then what results is more war, more destruction, more pain, more suffering. And so what they had seen is that kings are pretty rough. Now, at the same time, in Greece, there was this idea that maybe people should be allowed to vote. They should be allowed to pick their own leaders. But that had its own problems too, because certain leaders would be chosen that knew how to sort of manipulate the crowds, manipulate the people. And so often, leaders that were not good were chosen. I don't know if that sounds familiar to anybody even today. That sometimes still happens, as I'm sure you know. And so this idea of a new kind of king sort of rose in the philosophy of the Greeks. And Socrates and Plato had this idea that what we need is a philosopher king. Now, Socrates and Plato were philosophers, so of course they had a high opinion of what philosophers could do. But they began to teach and began to talk about this idea that what we need is a king who's a philosopher first, and that if he's a philosopher first, then he's incorruptible. He won't go in for all the silliness that all the other brutal kings will go in for. Instead, he will be incorruptible. He'll be able to use his mind, to use his thought processes to lead the people in a type of goodness. And so that idea got passed down, first from Socrates to Plato, and then to a guy named Aristotle, which you might have heard of. And Aristotle had a student named Alex, maybe better known as Alexander the Great. Now, Alexander the Great is what people say about him was he was a philosopher. He studied philosophy. He used his mind as much as he used his body in battle. And Alexander the Great set out to conquer the world. And so in a sense, Alexander the Great was the ultimate of the philosopher kings. And so this idea that a philosopher who becomes a king is incorruptible was proven wrong by Alexander. Millions of people were killed under Alexander's march across, first across the Greek area and then on into Persia. Millions of people. And so over and over we've seen this cycle where we try a new form of government and it works in some ways, but it also causes pain and suffering. And so here is the gift that God promises the world, that one day He would send someone to the earth that knows how to handle things, that can do what no human government or no human individual in a leadership role has ever been able to do. I like this quote from Winston Churchill. He once said that that a republic is a terrible form of government. It's just the best we've figured out so far. And I like that because it's like it's admitting that, hey, what we have is good compared to what has been tried in the past. But it still has problems. It still has a room for corruption. It still has room for pain and suffering. And what we need is we actually need a benevolent king. We need an incorruptible king. And in a sense, Plato and Socrates and Aristotle had it right that if we could have an incorruptible king and incorruptible leaders, it would make a difference. It's just that we're never going to find that among humans. So, with all that said, in some sense, that's what Christmas is about. To bring about a person who could actually fulfill that role that has been talked about for centuries, and we've never been able to find it. Every 4 years we get excited about a new leader, and then we get disappointed about a new leader every single time. And so let's see what the Bible has to say about this concept. I think you'll be interested. So we've got a few passages that we're going to look at. Some of them are just a verse, and some of them are just a couple of verses. So we're going to jump into Jeremiah first. Now Jeremiah is sometimes called, you may have heard this, he's sometimes called the crying prophet or the weeping prophet. We actually have quite a bit about Jeremiah, things that were going on. Jeremiah was writing and prophesying actually before Judah went into exile. So at this time, the government is getting more and more corrupt in Jeremiah's time. They're heading towards this point where God is going to judge them. God is going to bring them into exile. So things are getting kind of a little bit more difficult, each day. And Jeremiah sees this, and so he's prophesying. And what we're going to look at is he's prophesying about how the future is going to be, the far future, this future where God brings in this amazing new government. So the first we're going to look at is Jeremiah 23, 3 through 4. Here's what it says. I will gather the remnant of my flock from all the lands where I have banished them. And you may say, well, what is that about? Well, you see, God, in the way that He would judge His people, the way that He would discipline them, is He would send them out into exile. But then it says He will then later gather them back up. He will bring in those who have been dispersed. And I think it's meaningful here that He uses this term of flock. He sort of presents His people as sheep. And sometimes we kind of can see that in our own sort of society where people will follow a leader if that leader is, charismatic and able to kind of pull people along. And so I like that idea, and he's going to kind of carry that idea of sheep and flock through. So he says, I'll gather the remnant of my flock from all the lands where I have banished them, and I will return them to the grazing land. They will become fruitful and numerous. I will raise up shepherds over them who will tend them. They will no longer be afraid or discouraged, nor will any be missing. This is the Lord's declaration. Now, I've highlighted that word shepherds because I think it's a really important one. Now, they've had shepherds up to this point. In fact, they have a type of shepherd at this very moment when he's writing this. A particular king of Judah is still sitting on a human throne. But most of the kings of Israel and even the kings of Judah in the south were not good kings. They didn't please the Lord. They were disobedient. They allowed the people to worship idols. They allowed all kinds of deplorable things to happen in the nation. And so what this is saying is that in this future era, in this future kingdom of heaven, there's going to be shepherds that the Lord actually raises up, that He actually appoints. And these are going to be a different kind of shepherd. Now, the word shepherd really is a metaphor, but it's a really good metaphor. Because what people need is they need good leadership. So He says, I will raise up shepherds over them who will tend them. They will no longer be afraid or discouraged. Have you ever been afraid or discouraged by maybe things that happen in politics, maybe things that happen from some leaders, whether it's in education or in local government or national government or state government? Ever been afraid or discouraged by things that are happening? I know that I have, and in fact, I see it all the time. A lot of what we see in the media, in the news, is driven by being afraid of what one party or the other party might do. So what this is saying is, what we have to look forward to in the kingdom to come, in the kingdom of heaven, is no more of that. The shepherds that God's going to raise up, they're not going to lead by bringing about fear and discouragement. It's going to be a different kind of world altogether. Nor will any be missing. This is the Lord's declaration. They will serve the Lord their God and David their king. Now put that in, I highlighted that because that's a really interesting statement. You say, oh, okay, so maybe David has not been made king yet. Actually, when Jeremiah is writing this, David had been dead for 500 years, or a little bit more than 500 years. So what Jeremiah is saying on behalf of the Lord, who is speaking through him, is that in this future era, David, and names him, it doesn't say someone like David, it says David their king is going to be present. He's going to be part of it. And we would say, well, how is that possible? Because he's already been dead for 500 years. Well, notice what the rest of the line says. It says, they will serve the Lord their God and David their king, whom I will raise up for them. So what he's saying is, David is going to be resurrected and he's going to be put back in charge of Israel. That's fascinating to me. David, probably the greatest king the world has ever known. Now, David had his problems, right? I mean, he had a rooftop view of someone's bathing area, and that caused him all kinds of trouble. It got him into some really dark, places. But as a king, he was chasing after the heart of God. And that's the kind of leadership that God wants in His future kingdom. And so what He says is, He's going to raise up shepherds. And notice it's plural. Let me back, well, I won't back up, but it's plural. He's going to raise up shepherds, but a great example of the kind of shepherds that He's going to raise up, and literally, specifically, David will be one of those main shepherds. And so in Israel, David will be there. Now, just in case we get the idea that this is a metaphor, he actually mentions this, other prophets mention this as well in other places, like Ezekiel. Let's see what Ezekiel has to say about the future kingdom. He says, I, the Lord, he's speaking on behalf of the Lord, I, the Lord, will be their God, and my servant David will be a prince among them. I, the Lord, have spoken. Now, for Israel, David's era was the golden age, right? I mean, it's the age that they all would look back at. Because what happened was, under David, the kingdom became united. Okay, there were 12 tribes, and up until David's time, and to some extent, Saul was part of reuniting them in some ways, but under David, it became a strong, powerful kingdom. And so when Solomon, his son, took over, the kingdom became divided, and it became a really difficult place. Solomon allowed idolatry to come in, and ultimately it became a pretty dark place for a lot of years through some really bad kings. And so for the Jewish people, they would look back at the time of David and think, man, if we could only get back to that. And what the prophets are saying is, in a sense, you'll be getting back to that, but it'll be even better. Because you can imagine, once David is raised up and others are raised up as shepherds, they will be incorruptible. Because they will have left their sinful nature behind, and they will be in the Lord resurrected. So David will be a prince among them, and he says the Lord has spoken. Here's another instance where he says it, my servant David will be king over them, and there will be one shepherd for all of them. Now, I'll tell you, my take on this verse is he's saying that David will be a shepherd over them, but there's a shepherd above David. So David is going to be sort of like a governor of the region of Israel, I guess we could say, but there will be one shepherd that is what we sometimes call the King of Kings. So David, in a sense, is a prince. He's a type of king, but he's a prince under the King of Kings. So we'll have the King of Kings, and we'll have David, and they'll both be fulfilling a particular role. So my servant David will be king over them, and there will be one shepherd for all of them. They will follow my ordinance and keep my statutes and obey them. Now, what I love about this is it's so specific. I mean, a lot of times we think about the heaven and the kingdom of heaven and what's to come is kind of this sort of floating around in the clouds. We don't know what's going on. But the Bible actually tells us a fair amount about what to expect in this kingdom era. Let's read on and see what else Ezekiel says. They will live in the land that I gave to my servant Jacob. See, there's another very specific thing. They are going to be in Israel. So this is still on the earth. This is still on this earth. Although, as far as we can understand, it's going to be a renovated earth. It's going to be changed considerably, but the land of Israel is still there. And so when God said, I'm going to give, he says it to Abraham, he says it to Jacob, I'm going to give your descendants this land. It will be their inheritance forever. He means forever, that they will keep that forever. They will live in the land that I gave to my servant Jacob, where your fathers lived. They will live in it forever with their children and grandchildren, and my servant David will be their prince forever. So not only will David be raised up, but he's there for good. He's going to be there forever. It's an amazing thought. And I love that he mentions forever a couple of times, because for the Jewish people and for many other people groups throughout history, there are terrible things that happen, usually having to do with war, where people get displaced. I mean, in the world right now, there are some massive refugee camps. And it's deplorable, but it's like we don't know what else to do when 10,000, 20,000, 30,000 people get displaced from a country and they have to move to a new place. It's terrible. And sometimes they survive and they thrive, but a lot of times it's just a terrible situation. And so what he's saying is, once this era comes, the people that get to live in the land, they get to live there forever. They're never going to be pushed out again. They're never going to be dispersed again. They're never going to be killed. They're never going to be subject to genocide. They get to stay forever. So we begin to see why the Jewish people were so excited about their king, about their Messiah who was to come. Because remember, for them, they didn't see it as the Messiah will come and then thousands of years later the kingdom would come. They saw it as one and the same event. That when the Messiah comes, kingdom will come at that same moment. They didn't recognize that there would be a distance between those two. So I just want to kind of lay out what we've seen so far. So the first thing that we see is that, and we'll see, we have a few more verses about this, but the Son of Man is the King of Kings, right? We know because all through the Bible, he's talked about as the King of Kings. He will be the ruler of the world. But the surprising thing to you, and it was to me when I first saw that, is that David himself will be resurrected and will be a type of shepherd prince or a shepherd king who's underneath Jesus. Now, we are going to kind of fill out this, I'll call it a chart. We're going to kind of fill out this chart a little bit more with some more verses. Some we find in Daniel. Now, Daniel had some visions, right? A lot of Daniel's prophecies actually came in sort of an audio-visual format where he could actually see things, not only hear the voice of the Lord, but he would actually see visions. And so in this first one, we're actually getting one of his visions. It's that famous one where there's this huge statue, and it's made out of, the head is gold, and there's a part that's bronze, there's a part that's iron, and then that iron is mixed in with clay. And if you read through it, what you begin to recognize is that each part of the statue represents represents an era in the future for Daniel. And so the head represented the Babylonian Empire. The next, which I believe was bronze, represented the Medo-Persian Empire. The next was the Greeks and then the Romans. And so he's kind of laying out the future. He's saying this is what's going to happen. And so he's kind of talking about kingdom. He's talking about government in this vision. And then he goes into this description of what is going to come at the end of all human government. What happens at the end? And so here's what Daniel has to say. It says, in the days of those kings, he's talking about like the ending of those empires that we just mentioned. In the days of those kings, the God of the heavens will set up a kingdom that will never be destroyed. And this kingdom will not be left to another people. Now we learn a couple of things from this. And in his vision, what he shows is that each of these kingdoms, one after another, is sort of supplanted by the next, or it's destroyed by the next. Like the Medo-Persians came in and beat the Babylonians, basically by realizing that there was a gate under a river that went under their wall. They went in and they took over the Babylonians. And that was the end of the Babylonian Empire, because somebody put a gate in a place that the army could get in. And that was it. And then after the Medo-Persians, you've got the Greeks. We talked about Alexander. Alexander was this brilliant military leader who marched across the world and killed millions, but he sort of brought the Greek Empire into its own. And then that split into a number. And then you have the Roman Empire. But each of these, in succession, would last for a while, and then they would crumble. And so notice what he says. He says this kingdom that's coming, this kingdom, we sometimes call it the kingdom of heaven, it will never be destroyed. It will always stand. Now that is something that humans have proved unable to do. There is no human government, no human organization that has lasted for the entirety of human history except that which God is involved in. And so God is the only one that can say, we're going to make a kingdom that's going to last forever. So in those days, those kings, the God of heavens will set up a kingdom that will never be destroyed, and this kingdom will not be left to another people. Here's what he says after that. It will crush all these kingdoms and bring them to an end, but will itself endure forever. Now, for the Jewish people, you can imagine how exciting this would be, right? Because at this point in history, they've been dispersed, they've been exiled, they've been persecuted, they've been the subject of genocide. It has been a really painful run for them. And they are about to be exiled again when, or they are in exile right now when Daniel is writing. And so you can imagine this is an open wound for them, that their kingdom that began with Saul and then sort of that golden era of King David, it has now come to an end. I mean, you can imagine being in the last days of, say, your own nation, America. I mean, imagine how painful that would be to think back on your history. And what he's saying here is, hey, God hasn't forgotten you. There's going to be this kingdom who takes over the rest of them. And it's going to be a kingdom that God brings to the earth, and it will have no end. Notice what he says in chapter 7. He says, and this is a different vision, I continued watching in the night visions, and suddenly one like a son of man was coming with the clouds of heaven. He approached the Ancient of Days and was escorted before him. Notice that phrase in there, Son of Man. That's one of, it seems, Jesus' favorite phrases to identify with or to call himself. And so it's something that Daniel uses. Notice what he says next. You who have, this is in is that the end of the Daniel passage? Yeah. So I continued watching in the night visions, and suddenly one like a son of man was coming with the clouds of heaven. He approached the Ancient of Days and was escorted before him. Now we're going to look at the rest of that verse in a second, but I want to share with you a couple of verses from the New Testament. Now we're kind of getting out of Christmas according to the prophets here by going to the New Testament, but the New Testament writers were prophets too. And so we're going to look at a quote from Jesus to kind of fill out that chart that we're putting together. But on this one, what I want to bring your attention to once more is the Son of Man. And so that sort of connects us to the coming of Jesus, which is what we think of as Christmas. So let's look at a couple of quotes from Jesus that help us kind of understand what this future kingdom is going to include. So this is Jesus talking to his disciples. He says that, and specifically the 12 disciples, okay? So not necessarily everybody that follows Jesus. Notice what he says, "You who have followed me in the regeneration, when the Son of Man shall sit on the throne of his glory." You see that connection between Daniel. He's calling himself the Son of Man here. In the regeneration, when the Son of Man shall sit on the throne of his glory, you also shall sit upon 12 thrones, judging the 12 tribes of Israel. So here, what we have is 12 Jewish apostles who he's saying to them, because you followed me, and because you've been faithful to me, when I return, when the Son of Man comes back, sort of like Daniel was talking about, when the Son of Man comes back, you will also have places of authority in this kingdom. And he calls it judging. And so they're on thrones, and so it's a leadership sort of position, but they're going to be judging the 12 tribes of Israel. So this is sort of another internal sort of part of the administration that God is going to set up in the future kingdom of heaven. Now here's another thing that we see in Luke. He says this, "And he said to him, 'Well done, good servant, because you were faithful in a very little, you have authority over 10 cities.'" Now you may be thinking, why are we jumping to that? Well, once again, what we see in Jesus' parables is this promise that faithful people will be put in charge, faithful believers who are faithful now, in the kingdom of heaven will be put into some type of role where they are leading. And in this case, they will be leading cities. He says to one that's moderately faithful, he'll be in charge of 5 cities. To one who's more faithful, he'll be in charge of 10 cities. So we see these kind of different levels in this future kingdom of heaven. We see the Son of Man. We saw David. We also saw tribes. We see, well, actually, why am I doing that by memory? Let's just look at the chart. So Israel in the kingdom of heaven. This is what we see in Scripture. Is the King of Kings, the Son of Man, who is going to eventually return and set up this worldwide kingdom, but then also tells us that David will be raised up. David will be their shepherd prince, their king, and so he will be underneath the King of Kings in authority. But then what Jesus reveals to us is that there will be 12 roles of some type of judgment where they'll hold court or something. We don't know a whole lot about what it means, but they will have some kind of leadership role. And now, by the way, the 12 apostles, 11 of them were the ones that walked with Jesus. There is one who, it tells us in John 6, never believed, that's Judas. And so that 12th is probably Mattathias, who was the guy, you remember at the beginning of Acts, he was chosen by casting lots. That doesn't matter right now. It's not necessary. Judas won't be in there, that's what I'm saying. Okay, anyway. And then shepherd, and so I think then there's probably many roles of shepherding of some kind. Because you remember in that Jeremiah passage, it says that he will raise up shepherds. That's a plurality of shepherds. And so I think, this is kind of theoretical on my part, not only will there be sort of a prince of an area, not only will there be kind of these regional people that help lead, I think there will actually be those that are on a more local level. I'm just calling them shepherd overseers. And I connect that to what Jesus said in those parables about being kind of in charge of a city here, or maybe a few cities around there. We might call it like a governor or something. I don't know exactly, but there's reference to this concept that there's various leadership roles in the coming kingdom. And then there will be people that are reaping the benefit of this leadership. So this is what we see in the prophets. So when the people of, say, Jeremiah's time or Ezekiel's time, when they're hearing these passages, now they wouldn't have known some of these about the apostles and the other stuff, but when they're hearing about the Messiah coming, they're thinking about this kingdom. And they're probably thinking very practically. They're not thinking about floating on a cloud playing a harp someday. They're thinking about a kingdom that comes to earth, and it's led by Messiah. It's led by Christ, who will, administer this worldwide kingdom. And so I love the idea that we could get into that mindset. Now, one thing that you might be wondering is a lot of this is about what's going to happen in Israel during the kingdom of heaven. But what about the rest of the world? Is the rest of the world just like nuked and nothing's happening? Well, actually, I want to return back to Daniel's vision because he says some interesting things that kind of answer this question. Because a lot of us here are Gentiles, and so what's the Gentile role in the future kingdom of heaven? Well, here's what we have in Daniel 7 once again. So remember, this is his vision. So we're returning to that. He was given, and he is the Son of Man. He was given dominion and glory and a kingdom. Let's just define those words. Dominion means to rule, right? He's given a domain, and his domain is the world. And so he's given dominion, he's given glory, and a kingdom. So he's given this kingdom that encompasses the world. And when it says glory, I take that kind of practically. Sometimes we think of that as really kind of nebulous. I take that very practically, meaning that people know who he is. They recognize him. They look up to him. It's not that they're crushed. They want him as their leader, as their king. So he was given dominion, glory, and kingdom so that those of every people, nation, and language should serve him. So what we find out is that this is happening in Israel, but in the same way, this worldwide kingdom is also happening in other nations. Now, a lot of people seem to sort of think that once we get to the kingdom of heaven, it's all just one mob of people and there's no distinction. But notice it mentions nations, it mentions languages. And so it seems that there will still be some sort of form of nation division and languages, and I think culture. I think there will be preserved culture even in the kingdom of heaven because we see that division, that these nations and these different languages will be preserved in the kingdom of heaven. And it's such an interesting image of what the kingdom of heaven will be. It's going to be a very, very interesting world. It's not just like this homogeneous, everybody's floating on a cloud. There's going to be culture. There's going to be, maybe we'll all learn a bunch of languages. I don't know, but it's very textured. And so he was given dominion and glory and a kingdom so that those of every people, nation, and language should serve him. His dominion is everlasting. There again, we see that concept that it lasts forever. Let's see what else he says. Dominion, let's see, it feels like that's the middle of a sentence. His dominion is an everlasting dominion that will not pass away, and his kingdom is one that will not be destroyed. What an amazing statement when we think about all this. I mean, this is very practical. Now, I don't know why it is that a lot of times we kind of shy away from trying to be specific about what God has said about the future kingdom, but there's actually quite a bit. In fact, there's a couple more short little passages that I want to look at. Here's what he says in Micah. In the last days, the mountain of the Lord's house will be established at the top of the mountains and will be raised above the hills. People will stream to it. Now, you might say, what is the mountain of the Lord's house? Well, in Jerusalem, there is a hill, or we could call it a mountain. Some would call it Mount Moriah, and that is where the Temple Mount is. Now, currently, there's not a temple, but in this future kingdom, apparently there will be a temple, and it will be sort of a focal point of the world. And so notice what it says. It says at the very last there, peoples will stream to it. So this will be a focal point. This will be sort of the center of the world that people are looking toward, that they'll travel, they'll make pilgrimage. But it's fascinating what he says next. And many nations will come and say, "Come, let us go up to the mountain of the Lord, to the house of the God of Jacob. He will teach us about his ways so we may walk in his paths." So people will come from all over the world. They'll come to Jerusalem, up to that mountain, and they will learn. And so it seems that the Lord will be actually there teaching. He'll be there sharing wisdom. And it seems that that is a pastime of the world. People want to know, what does our Messiah King say? And so they will stream there. And it did say stream, right? Am I making that up? Yeah, peoples will stream to it. So that makes it feel like it's thousands, maybe millions of people will go there on a regular basis to listen to the Lord. That's amazing. Sometimes as we read the Gospels, it's kind of like, man, I wish I could sit there and, on those days when Jesus was teaching and just soak it up. Well, people are going to get to in the kingdom of heaven. So that's really exciting. Here's what Micah says after that. For instruction will go out of Zion, and the word of the Lord from Jerusalem. And so his instruction, his teaching will permeate the world. It will be broadcast in some way. Now, we don't know exactly how that is, but it will go out from there. Now, my theory is people will stream in, they'll hear what the Lord has to say, and then they'll carry it out. Or maybe he'll be on the radio. I don't know how it'll work, but it will stream out in some way throughout the world. And so imagine, I've had this thought recently that when we elect a leader of any kind, it could be local, it could be national, one thing that has sort of become a place that political leaders don't touch is spiritual leadership. But this leader, this king, will be not only a political leader, but he will also be a spiritual leader. He's going to be teaching people on a personal level how to live in a righteous way, and it's going to be amazing. Here's what he says next. He will settle disputes among many people and provide arbitration for strong nations that are far away. So he is a king of kings because he is not only teaching, he's not only telling, giving out wisdom, but he is actually arbitrating between nations. So to some extent, the United States does this even in our world today, but our success rate we sometimes do okay and sometimes it's not so great. But like for instance, we've been trying to arbitrate peace in the Middle East for years and years and years and mixed results. But what Jesus will do, what the Messiah will do, this Messiah King, he will arbitrate perfectly peace throughout the world. It's why when angels came at the Messiah's birth, they said, peace on earth. Now, did peace on earth arrive at that moment? Not exactly, because it's, we've seen some not peace eras since then. But peace on earth will arrive when Messiah brings the kingdom. Okay, so he will settle disputes among many peoples and provide arbitration for strong nations that are far away. I love that it puts in strong nations because it's not that he's just dominated over these other nations and made them weak. He allows other nations to be strong, and he still arbitrates them. And so it's not the kind of cruel leadership that we see in governments of the past and even to some extent today, where you have to kind of keep your enemy sort of low and destroyed. He will allow nations to be strong, and he will still arbitrate peace between them. They will beat their swords into plows. This is probably one of the most famous phrases about that future kingdom, that they will beat their swords into plows and their spears into pruning knives. So all of the soldiers no longer are soldiers. They'll be involved in other jobs. I don't think this means that everyone who would have been a soldier is going to be a farmer necessarily, but you get the idea. Nations will not take up the sword against nation, and they will never again train for war. So there won't be a military. There won't be need for a military. There won't be need for military training. Do you know that our national budget for military is in the hundreds of billions? I don't know it off the top of my head, but a huge amount of our tax money has to go to military because we just don't know how else to be secure. But in this era, that's not needed. There won't be need to be training young men and young women to go to war. There won't be need to be training people how to kill and how to defend themselves, because this is an entirely different era, something the world has never seen before. But each person will sit under his grapevine and under his fig tree with no one to frighten him. That sounds like a nice day. Doesn't mean that you have to always sit under the fig tree. I'm sure there's other things going on, but you can literally just sit down and not have to worry about a thing. You don't have to worry about what the government's doing. You don't have to worry about what the military's doing. You don't have to worry about foreign conflicts. You don't have to worry about any of that. You can just focus on pursuing joy in the simple things. But each person will sit under his grapevine and under his fig tree with no one to frighten him, for the mouth of the Lord of armies has spoken. Last verse from Micah. We will walk in the name of the Lord our God forever and ever. I don't know about you, but that sounds pretty good. I mean, I think about the unrest that we experience on a daily basis. And it's really easy to blame our government or blame our leadership. But the problem is that it's inside of us. Any one of us in this room, if we're given absolute power, we'd probably fail, right? We'd find ways to let that corruption rise to the top. And it almost feels like for all of human history, God is allowing us to prove this to ourselves. That no matter how intelligent of a governmental system, how intelligent of a monarchy or a republic we create, we still find a way to corrupt it. We turn it into something ugly eventually. And so what it reminds us of, and I know this is not a normal Christmas message, but what it reminds us of is that the Christmas present that we need is not only Jesus to save us from our sins, but a worldwide Messiah, King, to save us from the corruption that we constantly create in our world. And when we look toward a future world like that, I think it's something we can be excited about. Got one more very short verse for you. I love this one. He says, for the earth, is talking about this era, for the earth will be filled with the knowledge of the Lord's glory as the waters cover the sea. Wouldn't that be a different kind of world? A world where anybody you meet, you can have a conversation about the Lord with them. Because His knowledge covers the world like the waters cover the sea. I don't know if you noticed it, but as soon as I read that, it started raining just a little bit harder. For those that are watching the live stream, it's raining here, and so that was sort of dramatic. But the knowledge of the Lord will cover the earth. To me, that's exciting, to think about living in a world like that. So let's just think for a second about what it will be like to live in any nation during the kingdom of heaven. So not only will this be happening in Israel, but it seems that this is also the case in other nations. That there's going to be a King of Kings, and that's going to be the Son of Man, the Messiah. That'll be Christ. But then there will be shepherd princes of some kind. Now, it seems that when David is talked about in Scripture, he's specifically going to be raised up to lead Israel. And Israel is a nation. It's one of the nations of the future kingdom of heaven. So it seems that there will be others raised up to lead those other nations that are outside of Israel. By the way, this is sort of theoretical. I mean, we're kind of putting the pieces together. We might get to it and realize, hey, we were a little bit off on this or that. We don't know, but this is what it seems like it's saying. We're more specific on what he says about Israel. So we know that they said David will have that role in the future kingdom and all of that. So we're kind of extrapolating here. But as far as we can tell, there'll be some kind of shepherd prince raised up for other nations, and there'll be maybe shepherd judges like those apostles or leading the tribes of Israel. Maybe there'll be roles like that as well. It seems that there'll be other types of shepherds just in general, because there are quite a few faithful believers who God will appoint to various positions, and then there will be people who benefit from these shepherds and this leadership. So, my guess is that this may be a little different than your vision of what the kingdom of heaven was like. And so, I think it would be interesting to have just we got a couple of minutes. I think it'd be interesting to just talk a little bit about what strikes you, what kind of stands out to you in these verses that that we looked at today. I'm thinking about the live stream. If you're watching on the live stream, I'll try to repeat some of the comments so you guys can hear it, because I'm not sure they'll be able to hear it. But what stands out to you guys about these verses? Anything kind of jump out at you? Or anything surprising, too? Yeah, Stephanie?
So the kingdom will, I know this is probably very basic, in heaven or on earth, or it'll all be one?
Great question. Yeah, so when we look at kind of how the end times work, the best we can make sense of it is Christ is going to return, and when He returns, He's coming from heaven. He's going to return to the earth and set up His kingdom on the earth. And the reason why I say that, well, there's a number of reasons, but one of the reasons why I say that is because when it talks about this future kingdom era, it mentions that that Israelites will possess the land, and so it's got to be on the earth, because it says they will inherit that land forever. They'll live in the land, and so yeah, it seems that this kingdom of heaven is not removed from the earth. Now, what is the role of heaven in the kingdom of heaven? I don't actually know. I don't know how that fits in. What we do find, though, later in the narrative, when he recreates a new heaven and a new earth, it tells us that a new Jerusalem comes down out of heaven. So it makes it sound like there's a heaven, and then there's an earth. There'll be a new heaven, new earth eventually, and then there's a new Jerusalem that somehow can move between. I mean, I don't know exactly. I don't know how that works, but it says it comes down out of heaven. So some really mysterious things, but it's exciting to think about. So, other thoughts or things that stood out to you? I just realized what I did is you said one thing and then I talked a long time. Did you have any more thoughts on that, or how did that?
I guess my other question is, what about the people who have died? Will they come back? Because the dead are going to be brought back. So will they be brought back to this kingdom? And I know you don't know, but will they be brought back to this earth?
Yeah, absolutely. So in Thessalonians, what it tells us is that the dead in Christ will rise. It says that those who have died before, so when Jesus returns, there's going to be still people living on the earth, of course. And so people who have died before his return are with him right now. I mean, Paul says that to be absent from the body is to be present with Christ. And so those people's spirits are with Christ at this moment. Now, what it tells us is when he returns, he's going to bring them with him, and he is going to reunite their spirit with a resurrected body. And so they're going to be rebodied. I don't know what other verb you'd put that, but they're going to have a new body. And that's going to kind of happen. I assume it's just an instant before those who are alive on the earth will be caught up to be with him. And so when he returns, the best we can understand it is that his return is going to be sort of a partial return, because it tells us that he comes and we will meet him in the clouds. So what it seems like it's saying is he comes and resides not yet stepping down on the earth, and then the tribulation period happens while he's sort of got us with him, and then it'll be a full return to the earth, set up the kingdom. Now at that point, when he sets up the kingdom, there will be this event that we sometimes call the judgment seat of Christ, where those who have been faithful to him, he will appoint them what they're going to do. That's our best understanding of it. I'm saying "are" because I didn't come up with these ideas. It's sort of theologians have kind of put this together. But does that kind of answer the thought? Yeah. And I will admit, when we're talking about end times, there's some speculation here. We know what the verses say, and we sometimes feel very confident that we know exactly what they mean. But I think, full disclosure, some of the details, we may, when Christ returns, it may be like, oh, I thought that was going to be that way, but it's this way. I'm way happier that it's this way than the way I thought it was, because he's a better architect of how all this is going to happen than we could ever be. So, other thoughts or other things that stood out to you, or questions?
Yeah, I didn't know about David coming back as a ruler.
Yeah, isn't that amazing?
That's pretty cool.
Yeah.
I didn't know that. That was very interesting.
It's intriguing to think about all of the people in leadership that are, believers. It's very possible that a person who is in human leadership right now, who is a believer but is a really, not very faithful to the Lord, in the kingdom may not be a ruler. And then people who are not rulers now, not in charge of anything, but are very faithful to the Lord, will actually be some type of ruler in the kingdom. It turns out that David was both a good ruler during his life, and he was faithful to the Lord, and so I think that's why we see that. But I think it's why we see in Scripture a number of times Jesus says the first will be last, and those who are great will be least in the kingdom of heaven. It's going to be a big swap, I think, for a lot of people, because sometimes leadership roles attract people who have some desire for power or some desire for some greedy pursuits. And so you can see how the world is going to be very different. I mean, the types of leaders that we're going to see in the kingdom of heaven may be very different than the types of leaders we have today. And I'm thinking that's probably a good thing. Donna, yeah.
I have realized that I've gotten confused a lot about the kingdom of heaven. So what we're talking about here, the kingdom of heaven is the millennium. And I don't think the scriptures actually talk about the new earth until we get to Revelation. Is that?
Yeah, that's my view, yeah. This, what we're talking about, most of the verses that we looked at today are what we would put in a category called the millennium, the millennial reign of Christ. And so our best understanding is that as soon as Christ returns and sets up his kingdom, that kingdom is forever, but there's sort of what we might call like a first phase. And it's where he's renovating the earth, but it hasn't been completely made new yet. And so Revelation tells us that period will happen for 1,000 years, as you're referring to. And then when we get to the end of Revelation, we see this complete new thing where he remakes, new heaven, new earth, and the world itself even seems different. No more ocean, no more sea. It's just very, very different. And at that point, so that's actually 1,000 years into his reign, it's actually at that point that it says that there's no more pain, there's no more suffering. So something really changes at that point. And so yeah, this is my view, most of what we see in the prophets, I think is talking about the millennial kingdom. Because we see that the world is not, it seems in that era, the world is not completely perfect, but it's very renovated, it's very different. And so that's why I think it's not probably in that final phase. So does that make sense? Okay. Tommy, I think you had your hand up next.
Yeah, you touched on this briefly last week, and I'm just kind of curious. So many of these passages are connected to the Jewish people.
Mm-hmm, yeah.
Why is it that they don't believe it?
Well, okay, so most people of Jewish descent would believe most of what we read today because it came from the Old Testament. When we get to the New Testament would be where the disagreement would come. And you actually make a really good point. So for a lot of people of the Jewish faith, what they would say is, we know Jesus isn't the Messiah because the kingdom hadn't come. Because a lot of times when the Jewish scripture talks about the Messiah, it then also talks about this kingdom, where he's ruling the world, peace on earth, Israel is restored, all of these things. And so they look at that, and you can see why this would be the conclusion. They say, well, if there's not peace on earth yet, then that couldn't have been the Messiah, And so that's kind of where the rub comes, is that they're expecting the Messiah to also usher in this new era. And so Christians generally agree with Jews that yes, the Messiah will usher that in. We just see it as he came and then he left for a time and then will return. Now, we actually do see that concept in some of those passages, but that's basically why, is because it's very much wrapped up together in the prophets. One of the reasons why, this is a pretty good analogy. So prophecy doesn't always give all the details. And so I've heard prophecy described as like when you're looking at a mountain. So let's say there's a mountain here and there's a mountain here, okay? I can see this peak and I can see this peak up here, but I can't see the valley in between. But to me, from my vantage point, it kind of looks like those peaks could be like right next to each other. But if I got in there, I'd realize, those are 200 miles apart. And so prophecy kind of works that way. And we have that from other passages where he talks about how they'll be dispersed and they'll be regathered in the next sentence. That was a span of 70 years. They're dispersed, they're regathered. And so prophecy works like that. So that's one of the reasons, I think, is just that the prophets saw that the Messiah would come, and then right next to it, the next sentence, it talks about kingdom. And we just see it as there's a span between that. I think Megan had your hand up, yeah.
So during that 1,000 years, people will have normal lifespans and live and die, right? Or do they stay further?
Great question. There's some mystery on this, and we got to kind of take some guesses, because really what you're asking is, if we're resurrected, we know that those who are resurrected can't die. I mean, after that point, we're done with death. we won't die again. So there are passages that talk about kind of what we would call mortals, people who live a normal lifespan. And the question is, where do those people come from? We don't actually know. It does seem, though, that my favorite theory is that one of the sources of people who are going to live in the kingdom are people who have lived now that died before the age of accountability. So if there's a like my wife had a miscarriage last year, that baby, therefore, I think will get, this is a theory, but I think will actually get an opportunity to live out a lifespan in that millennial kingdom. And it's a really different experience. It's not the same as it would have been here. It's way better. One of the things that Isaiah, will actually look at it next week, one of the things Isaiah says is that lifespans will be different for those mortal inhabitants, that if you're 100 years old, you'll be considered a child, so they can live longer. It'll be very different. And so it seems like what we're seeing is we have kind of the resurrected people, which is most of what we're talking about here, those shepherds, David is resurrected, others will be resurrected. The apostles, they're all dead, but they'll be resurrected to fulfill this role. They can't die. But the people they're leading, it seems, are in some way mortal. We don't have a lot of details about that, but they're apparently somehow mortal. And here's another evidence. We'll look at it again next week. I'm going too long. We got to wrap up. But another evidence that there are going to be people born in this future kingdom is that Isaiah says that the increase of his government, the increase of his kingdom, has no end. So people will continue to be born, and so if there's people being born, it's possible to have a pretty normal life. So, whew, you guys got me all excited. Okay, we got to wrap up though. We're 5 minutes over. Let's pray. Father, thank you for your word, and thank you for the excitement of just talking about this and thinking through this. And Lord, I want to admit that we have so many questions and there's so much mystery, but we are just thrilled to think about what you're going to do in the kingdom, Lord. And I pray that we would be able to keep our focus on that we'd be able to pray for your kingdom to come on a regular basis, that we can keep that in our minds. Lord, I pray that would motivate us to be faithful to you. Lord, I pray that we could be faithful to you this week and look forward to your return. In your name, amen. Thank you, guys.